Hello, my name is Merle Eisenberg. I am one of the co-founders of this website along with Laura and Sarah. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the National Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center, or SSINC, at the University of Maryland. I'm a specialist in late antique and medieval history, and I did my graduate work at Princeton University. Among other topics that I work on are the history of pandemics and the history of disease. In today's lecture, I want to talk about something I've written extensively about, the Justinianic plague. This is the first recorded large-scale plague pandemic in human history. Now, I've written 3 articles so far and a few more works in progress on this topic, which you can find here on the website, along with my co-author, Lee Mordecai, who's a senior lecturer at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and a few other colleagues as well, I should say. What I want to do in today's lecture is to give you an introduction to the consensus view on the Justinianic plague. So if you Google around, this is what you'll find. Then I'll give you our take on the Justinianic plague, which is quite different from this. And then I want to introduce some teaching resources, some primary sources, using all different types of interdisciplinary fields that I think are a really nice way to teach the topic. And you can arrive at your own conclusions, or your students can as well. So, as I like to call it, your 30-second potted history of the Justinianic plague. Now, as I mentioned, the Justinianic plague is the first of 3 large plague pandemics in recorded human history. It starts in the year 541 and goes to the year 750. The second plague pandemic is perhaps one you're more familiar with. It's the Black Death, which starts in the mid-14th century and runs all the way through the 18th century. The third one, which has no name really, it's just called the Third Plague Pandemic, or as I like to call it, the Modern Plague Outbreak, starts in 1855, famously in China, and becomes a globalized pandemic in the 1890s and early 1900s, until it stops generally around the mid-20th century. So, the Justinianic plague, as I said, starts in the mid-6th century and runs for 2 centuries thereafter. Our first account of it is a famous one from the historian Procopius of Caesarea, which is one of the primary sources you'll see attached. He describes it starting in Egypt and spreading throughout the Middle East, Constantinople, which is the capital of the Roman Empire at the time, and then other sources will describe it throughout the rest of Europe. It will return in a series of what people have called quote-unquote waves over the course of these 2 centuries. Now, the consensus view on this outbreak is that within 3 or 4 years, it killed half the population of the Mediterranean world. What number this is hard to say because demographic data is really hard to come by, if at all possible from the ancient world, but perhaps tens of millions of people. It also is said to have both short-term effects in terms of changing economics and religious questions, and as well as long-term effects. This is sometimes seen as the end of the ancient world, the final nail in the coffin, if you will, of the Roman Empire, as well as leading to perhaps the early Islamic conquests, which begin in the 630s, about 75 years after the first outbreak. Or really more like 90, but such as it is. Now, this is all struck together because it's created a large narrative of how pandemic should work. Now, my work, along with Lee, has suggested this is a deeply problematic view of the world. We've suggested that, in fact, rather than using, say, 1 or 2 sources, such as Procopius, and assuming that's the case everywhere and imposing the Procopius model on every city and every rural location, that instead we should think about this as highly variable in different locations, right? We might think of this as perhaps a quilted patchwork quilt model of how this impact works. So in some locations, such as Constantinople, dense urban cities, we might expect it to have had a significant mortality rate. What that number is still very hard to tell, but significant. In other locations, it might have had far less of an impact. And so what we've suggested is that local models matter the most here, right? Take the local sources and see what they say about them. Tell us what Gregory of Tours, which is one of the sources I'll assign, is talking about the plague, right? Why does he talk about the plague as he does? What can we glean from his actual writings? So that's our way of suggesting into this. And again, if you're curious or want to know more, I've given the links to our articles, but if you have questions, feel free to reach out to me via email or any other form on Twitter, however you want to reach me. Now, That's your broad brush 30,000 foot view of the pandemic. How would you teach this? Well, how I've taught it here in a couple of lectures at the Naval Academy is using the primary sources and using interdisciplinary primary sources from all types of fields to see what different disciplines make of these things, right? Rather than using it to, say, create this holistic model, what can the local sources tell us, as I've said? So what you find attached here on the website is a whole bunch of ways to approach this question. And I'll walk through them very briefly. But as you'll see, they have a little bit of background material provided on here and some questions that I think might be useful within the links. So the first you have are what I've called government documents, right? We have two sets of sources here. One is the papyri from the Appian Archive in Egypt. Right? Our sources survive the best from Egypt due to its climate, much drier and more arid. So we have a whole bunch of papyri sources from this famous family called the Appian family. Right? So what you have here are a whole bunch of documents related to or spanning across the time of the Justinianic plague. The second series of documents are you have the laws that the Emperor Justinian passed at the time, placed in a longer context, the new laws he issued called novels, right, because they're new. And this gives us a sense of what laws are being issued. On both of these, you can easily dig into the data if you want to find out more about what this is. And I provided the links through our Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences paper to what these are. You can see these in an Excel file, so if your students are interested, or any of you are interested in what these laws are, right? There are some ideas of we're passing laws today in various countries to help out economically, to help out with public health, right? So what might some of these laws in the past look like as well? The second type of source I provided in two forms are two accounts, written sources, which is what good historians like us like to use, of the outbreak. The first is from Procopius's famous account of Constantinople. Right? This is what people will almost always use as the account of the plague, and they'll use this, as I say, to extrapolate elsewhere. So give this a read. What does it say? How much does the impact look like? The second source I've given is from Gregory of Tours, Bishop Gregory of Tours, the famous writer of his 10 books of history. Right? As a good early medievalist, this is our first great early medieval source. And so he gives an account of the outbreak of plague in what's now France today. Right? But pay attention to how he constructs the narrative. How does he look at what's happening? And what cities is he talking about? Right? And what can we use that to tell us about how many people died, or what the impact is, both the short and the long term? The third type of source I've given you are pollen samples. Now, pollen samples are a good way to perhaps look at demographic data. Right? We don't have good archival work from the ancient world. So what we have are proxy data, right? There are no census forms really left for the most part. So what pollen samples give us is you can look at them and basically drill down into them. And if you're really curious, I have a whole bunch of links I can send you on how this works. But you basically pull out the pollen samples on trees and the pollen samples on agricultural pollen. And both of these together, if you have fewer people on the land, what you see over time, or quite quickly sometimes, is more tree pollen, right? That's to say more woodlands and less agricultural land. And if there's more people on the land, you obviously see the other way around, so more intensive agricultural work. And what people have noticed with the Black Death is you can see an immediate drop-off in agricultural work. So you see basically a drastic drop in the mid-14th century in how many people seem to be working the land. So what I've done is provided this, which my colleague Adam Izdebski, who's from Poland, but working out of Vienna at the moment, he gives us this data from various parts of the Eastern Roman Empire, what's now Eastern Europe and Turkey. So see what that tells you about land use. Do we see a drastic drop-off in pollen samples? The next type of sources I've provided are the ancient DNA. This is the quote-unquote cutting-edge scientific work. What this work gives us is how many bodies we find that test positive for Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes plague, right? And this is definitely what the Justinianic plague was. It was Yersinia pestis. Pay attention to the number of remains that have tested positive. Pay attention here to the dating of them. Pay attention to the context, right? As many of us know, when you start to overwhelm hospitals, there are multiple issues with burials. So how are people buried? Where are these burials found? And how did these change over time? And particularly, how are they dated, as I said? And again, if you want more research and more details on all of this, feel free to reach out. The final type we have are inscriptions. Now, inscriptions are a really great way to understand both tombstones and building activity in the ancient world. So what we've provided here is, for the first time, as far as I'm aware, we've aggregated all of the inscriptions we could find from various regions of the Roman Empire. Now, there's problems with how these are put together, but this is the first time anyone's ever attempted something like this, as far as I'm aware. And what we put together is data from various places across Western Europe and Syria. What's been suggested is actually a few things about inscriptions. One, that we'd have more people who've died, and thus more inscriptions. And we've also had people suggest that there's fewer inscriptions, because fewer people died. Fewer people had more, there's less money, I should say, running around, and so you have less money to spend on building your stuff. So look at these three inscription data sets and see what you can find about them. So, in conclusion, I've offered you an introduction to the Justinianic plague. I've offered you our take on it, which again is quite different, but is not to say that people were not affected and that it didn't impact families. I fully believe that it did, and people were devastated, and this is an awful thing for people to go through. But to nuance this picture and to look at local perspectives, I think, is what's really missing at the moment in Justinianic plague research. And then finally, what I've offered for you is a series of primary sources for you to give to your students, for them to think with and for them to think about. So, thanks so much. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, or feedback on this, feel free to reach out to us or any of us on the website, and good luck.